All right, we're joined here by TYT's Michael Shure. We're outside of the U.S. Senate and also the Supreme Court, where Susan Collins just put a nail in the coffin of the 4-4 split and said that she would be voting to confirm Brett Kavanaugh. Michael and I were both in there. What struck me the most, both of us actually, was how non-conflicted she seemed to be about this decision. You know, there were people like Lisa Murkowski this morning who said she hadn't made up her mind until she walked onto the Senate floor. Jeff Flake, who knows whether he had really made up his mind or not, but he pretended at least to be torn on it.
He seemed angst-ridden, right. And I believe that he was, actually. I don't believe a lot of Flake, but I believe that this was really a tough one for him. She seemed like this was, it was all one way. There was no hesitation that she showed in that speech.
In fact, from at the very beginning of it, the way that she seemed to be kind of going hard in defense of Kavanaugh, left open the possibility that she was going to put that out. And then most of these Senate speeches have a however.
Right,
despite this, so I'm conceding this to the backers of Kavanaugh. However, this, and this. But then, and Michael said this to me as it was going through, and he was right. Once you got 20 minutes, 30 minutes into the applause for him, you're like, there's no way.
Yeah, I didn't see how she was going to turn it around. I didn't see how she goes back from all this, because it was about his judicial precedent and his take on that, which is at the bottom line what you're putting a justice on the Supreme Court for. And it made no mention of any of the others. So she was just lauding this guy for such a long time. I didn't see an opening, and we were right. There was no opening.
And her basic argument for confirming him is that he won't vote the way that he believes. Trust me, he believes all these things that I disagree with, but he promised me that he's not going to rule that way. But as we put in the title, there's, I think, a more fundamental reason that she decided to, or is voting to confirm Kavanaugh, and it goes back to the Bush family. A lot of people may not know. And by the way, if you have comments or questions, you can put them in the comment section here. Eric Byler's here. He can read them out for me or Michael. A lot of people don't know how close she is to the Bush family. There's the obvious Maine connection. They're a very Maine family, whether they like to talk about Texas or not. But in 92. Or 91 or 92, she was named to be small business administrator by President George H.W. Bush.
89, probably. It would have been 89, because Bush became president in 89. And that's when, I guess, I didn't even know that. You said it to me, Ryan. I did know that President George W. Bush phoned her over the past week, or, during this time, to really push for Brett Kavanaugh. So, yeah, that bloodline is in there for sure. And now knowing that, or remembering that she was the SBA administrator, that's a pretty big tie to that family and to this nominee, although he's not directly linked to the Bushes. He's certainly somebody that a Bush has advocated for pretty vocally.
And the connection here is that when the latter Bush was president, he was his staff secretary. Ironically, that's the same position that Rob Porter had until he was ousted from his position. But your staff secretary is someone who is like family. Like this, you're in every single Oval Office meeting. You're controlling the paper flow that gets to your desk. You're the guy who has to honestly tell the president, here's what Colin Powell says, here's what Rice is thinking, here's what Cheney's up to. And if your staff secretary isn't somebody that you trust, then you're completely in the dark. And Bush was somebody who already had an inferiority complex because he had all these smarter people around him that he knew were trying to outmaneuver him. And so he would rely on somebody like Kavanaugh. And so he's a Bush. He's kind of like an honorary member of the Bush family.
Right, and didn't he have? And this is I may be misremembering now. Wasn't there a role that he played in Bush v. Gore as well during that? Yes,
right. He was one of the kind of leading activists, making sure that the Brooks Brothers riot went off as it ought to, and engaged in the push to make sure they won Florida.
So there's almost an indebtedness there on the side of the Bushes to Brett Kavanaugh, and if Susan Collins was a sympathetic ear to that, taking a phone call from any president. Bush went to Yale as well. Yeah, I don't know if this was skull and bones, and I don't know any of those connections, but I do know that there is this kind of, in the Republican Party especially, but in both parties really, this allegiance that carries forward. And if you did that for me, I'm going to do this for you. I'm sure it went to why George Bush picked up the phone and called a number of these senators that were on the fence to say, confirm this man.
And there was reporting early on from Laura Bassett at the Huffington Post that a source had told her that Kavanaugh had pre-cleared that Collins had pre-cleared Kavanaugh, said, if you nominate him, I'm with him. There's a lot of speculation that it may have even gone the other way, that she told the White House that, hey, like, here's a guy, like, volunteered that to him. And I think it goes back to the nature of the resistance. Congratulations to the resistance, the George Bush allied resistance, for making sure that Kavanaugh can get on. And do you think that this will be a moment of reflection for the resistance and in how far they've gone in embracing the Bush administration figures, like people like Kavanaugh?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know that these movements have moments of reckoning like that. I think they just kind of plow forward. I don't think that they do those. I think what this is going to do, and we talked about this briefly, Ryan and I did, is there's a politicization now of the Supreme Court. Now, there are people, and I'm one of them, who said the Supreme Court should be an issue in every presidential election. It's the only sort of almost irreversible thing that a president can do, a legacy that any president leaves, whether he's impeached or not, and that is unchangeable at the moment. So I think that there's something to be said for politicizing this, because it is politics. That said, it went beyond the pale this time, and it really, I think it laid bare some of these tribalistic instincts that a lot of these people have, especially when you looked at all the women on the Republican side who didn't support, who supported Kavanaugh, didn't support Ford.
Yeah, and Kavanaugh laid it bare, said, he called the Democrats on the committee, "you people." He said that it was a well-orchestrated, well-financed campaign on behalf of the revenge on behalf of the Clintons. He sounded like a guy in a Fox News comment section. Susan Collins on the floor said that she hopes that Brett Kavanaugh will actually be a healing force.
She hoped that he would put an end to some of the divisiveness. It's hard to imagine that. I mean, this has accelerated it to a point, like they have barricades up at the Capitol. They've never done that before.
And the gallery, if you noticed, was mostly empty, and that was true this morning as well. And that's not because there aren't thousands of people here who want to be in there. They're locking the people out of their own gallery because they're nervous about protesters.
And the moment Collins opened her mouth, someone said, "Senator Collins, vote no, Senator Collins." And then other people were saying, they said that they were from Maine, speak up or show the people from Maine that you're from Maine. Essentially, it was a better chant than that, but it was that kind of a protest. And but Ryan's right. There were hardly any people in the gallery, and then most of them were just sat on their hands and watched. So, and there weren't applause that I noticed out of the gallery toward the end.
No, and it was interesting. There was actually, and Eric, if there's any questions, we could do one or two if you have a minute. There were about 4 people that looked like protesters who kind of stomped out in the middle of her speech when it was clear there was going to be no U-turn. Yeah. And they kind of symbolically, I think in a way, were stomping out and saying, all right, you're a lost cause. The fight is actually out the door. And there has been a fundraising drive to fund an opponent of Susan Collins that Adi Barkan started several weeks ago. It hit $2 million today, which is real money in Maine. The site is now down. You can just Google it if you want to find it. It's CrowdPack is the one that's hosting this fundraiser. The site has crashed. They're in the middle of her speech. The site crashed from it went over 2 million and then crashed during her speech.
It's amazing. I mean, these are the types of things that very often are an impulse, and very often they have staying power. She has managed to survive in Maine by feigning this kind of middle of the roadness, and then she gets, when it comes time to vote, she's always the girl to invite you to the dance and then cancel at the last second. I mean, that's really how it is.
And now, so immediately after she gave her yes vote, the thing that was expected followed, which was Manchin saying, "I'm a yes also." Now, what I want to get from you, how angry people should be about this at Joe Manchin. And I say, to me, there's a couple ways of looking at it. A Republican in this West Virginia Senate seat would not have held out until the last minute to look how other people were going to vote. I think the game he was playing here is that if Collins would have come out and said, I'm voting no, then Manchin would have been the deciding vote, and I think he would have been a no vote. I think because then all of the attention would have been on Collins and Murkowski as the people that took it down, not on him, even though technically all 50 are the deciding vote, or all 51 are the deciding vote in that situation. So he held out. Then he's a politician first. He sees, okay, well, he's getting confirmed. The only way I lose my seat, well, he can still lose the seat, but a significant way he loses his seat is by voting no in a state that Trump won by 40 whatever points. And so he says, it doesn't matter at this point, so I'm throwing down my yes vote and just crossing my fingers.
It was definitely calculated. I think I hadn't thought of the calculation exactly as you did. That if I hadn't thought of the fact that it would have pulled all the focus away from him no matter what. So if Collins was a no, he would have been an easy no. I think that's quite possible, waiting to see what Susan Collins.
Because all the news is Collins and Murkowski. That's who CNN wants on the air. That's who PBS NewsHour wants on. They don't care about one out of 49 Democrats.
That's true. And then also not getting any male Republicans to switch. People were saying that Cory Gardner was on the fence at some point this week. Jeff Flake, of course, didn't. He came out and said that he was a yes today. The political calculus here is interesting because you saw Heidi Heitkamp do something that was pretty brave. Kavanaugh, in the only poll, and this was after the hearing, the only poll out of North Dakota gave him 60% approval. 60. That's a big number in North Dakota when you're running for re-election as a Democrat in a state that's not terribly blue. Even though that seat, I don't think has been in Republican hands since 74 or something, but it's one of those bizarre states. But Joe Manchin didn't do that. Joe Manchin didn't take the risk, and he's up much higher. I mean, Heitkamp is down in the polls and likely will lose that seat, right? I mean, so she did what she felt was right. How she felt that way, and that wasn't shared by more senators, is surprising. But I don't know why Manchin waited other than what you said. So I think you have to be 100% right there. I think that's what figured into his motivation.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. How he ended up voting wasn't going to be about his conscience. It was going to be about who was voting which one way or the other. I think Heitkamp, partly the polls played in a direction that gave her freedom. Freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. Yeah, right. She's like, I'm down 10, 12 points in North Dakota. She's like, I'm just going to vote my conscience. And there aren't a lot of times when you're watching somebody vote and you think, like, that person did not take into account the politics here. They voted their conscience. And I think this is one of those cases where she's like, this was the right thing to do. I might lose anyway. But you know what? I'm going to go out with my head held high here.
And her brother said something like Heidi can now look herself in the mirror in the morning and not worry about it. She also said if it had been about politics, she would have voted to confirm him, right? I mean, isn't that what she said?
And maybe the politics flips and people who even supported Kavanaugh say, you know what? That's how she's always been. She's an independent voice. She's a strong woman. I disagreed with her on that, but at least I know that she's always she's not just a typical politician.
It's interesting now to see what Democrats in tight races do. Like Dean Heller, for example, in Nevada, he supported Kavanaugh. What's going to happen in his very close race where he's either up or down by 1 point? What's going to happen to some of these senators? I think about the open seat in Tennessee where you have Marsha Blackburn out there. What is her position as a Republican woman now? Does she say great for Kavanaugh, or does she, hedge a little bit?
Although Bredesen said he would actually support him.
Right. Well, that's true. But Bredesen's support by doing that, I think that race is all about independent voters, right? And so if he's trying to woo independent voters with that, I don't know if it's a great read on the electorate there. But everybody says that race is most about independent voters and people who aren't happy with trying to appeal to women who aren't happy with Trump. So I don't know about the no vote about why Bredesen did that, what motivated him. But I do know that there are these close races where this is going to factor. This is on every ballot now, all of a sudden. And I think that's going to be the interesting thing to monitor.
Anybody have any intelligent questions?
Leah McKeon was concerned about Kavanaugh lying under oath. And Holly Robbins was concerned about judicial temperament. Did Senator Collins try to address those issues?
She didn't really talk about the temperament question because there's nothing, I think, that she could say on that because the whole country watched him melt down and then they watched Matt Damon's portrayal of him melting down. So best for her to just kind of pretend that didn't happen.
Even Kavanaugh wrote that op-ed in the Wall Street Journal saying, even I saw myself do Matt Damon, right? And that's not really me, even though if you looked at his opening statement that day, there was nothing. He wasn't responding to anything. That opening statement was pugnacious, and it was out there. And, I thought, well, what about that statement? You weren't reacting to anything, right?
Too emotional in his opening statement.
Collins didn't talk about the lying or the perjury under oath either. And I mean, that before we knew Christine Blasey Ford's name, there were these issues about him perjuring himself before a Senate committee. And Collins didn't mention that. Democrats haven't really mentioned that very much either. It seems to all be going to Ford and, he did drink. That's where he perjured himself. But that's not exactly it.
Right. He perjured himself all up and down the board. I think Collins's hope that he will be a uniting influence on the court is a little absurd, but I do think there's a possibility that he's at least checked and John Roberts is checked for maybe a term or so. You don't want to invite the alleged rapist onto the court and then 2 months later come out with a bunch of radical 5-4 decisions. If you want to not because he necessarily has respect for the institution as an end in itself, but as a weapon to be deployed in the political war, you want the institution to have respect. And so in Robert's long game, I think, at least for a couple years, I think this will slow him down.
And, a couple of things about what you just said that reminded me that Collins said she hopes there will be fewer 5-4 decisions. Well, of course there will be now, right? I mean, she thought that would be a good thing, that the court is being independent and the court is being, not worried about politics. Well, that would reflect the politics. 5-4 reflected the politics, too. The other thing about this, as I heard you talk about Roberts, is this is now the Roberts court, right? And this is, Anthony Kennedy is gone. It was the Kennedy court now for a long time. It's now the Roberts court. He is the vote that will be that 5-4 vote when it happens, which is unbelievable, right? What will that do to him? I mean, I'm not a student of the court enough to know the way that justices evolved. I know that Harry Blackmun, who was appointed by Nixon, became much more liberal. I know that you saw that with Souter, who was appointed by Bush. What then? John Paul Stevens by Ford. What happens to Roberts? Do any of these men or women, or it's just men on that side, moderate?
And we'll find out. And I think Kavanaugh is going to continue to become a political issue. I think he'll be a 2020 issue with some candidates saying he ought to be impeached. And I think he'll be a campaign issue every presidential cycle until either he dies on the bench or he's impeached or they add justices to the bench. Any last thoughts?
No, last thoughts are that I think that this is going to be a bigger deal. Like you just said, in 2020, I think it's going to be a midterm deal now. All these members of Congress and senators are home now. I was with Will Hurd, the Republican in the 23rd District of Texas. He's a congressman. He has nothing to do with Brett Kavanaugh. All they wanted to talk to Will Hurd about was Brett Kavanaugh. It was Democrats and Republicans. And Will Hurd is he's an interesting guy because he's a Republican in a Democratic district. There were people with Beto buttons and Hurd buttons on. Really, they exist. I couldn't believe it at these Hurd things. And so I'm interested to see how this becomes who it works for, because it will work for some candidates, this Kavanaugh thing, and women voters, I think, are going to be outraged in some places. So that's what I think is going to be the takeaway immediately.